I was sitting alone in my apartment when my sister's text hit my phone like a slap across the face. If you're not going to babysit 4 kids, then don't even come to Christmas. No greeting, no please, just a command like I was hired help who'd forgotten her place. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding against my ribs. Before I could even process the sting, my parents chimed in. Dad's message was cold. She's right. If you can't help, don't bother showing up. Mum added, Emma has so much on her plate. You're single, you have time. I stared at that group chat, tears blurring the screen, feeling the familiar weight of being invisible in my own family. But this time, something inside me snapped. I typed back 4 words that would burn my family's perfect Christmas to the ground. Cool, then my 35,000 isn't showing up either. What they didn't know was that everything they believed about who saved this family was a lie. Have you ever been the one who gave everything and got erased for it? My name is Natalie Rhodes. I'm 35 years old and I work as a senior designer at a small firm in the city 4 hours away from the town where I grew up. I built this life carefully, piece by piece, in an apartment that's modest, but mine a quiet sanctuary from a family that never quite saw me as someone worth seeing. The text came through while I was still in my work clothes, standing in my kitchen with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. December had just begun, and the first hints of Christmas decorations were appearing in shop windows across the city. I should have been thinking about the holidays with something like anticipation. Instead, when my phone buzzed with Emma's name, my stomach tightened the way it always did. You're coming early this year, right? I need you here by the 20th. The kids are impossible, and I have holiday parties. No hello. No, how are you? Not even a question mark that might have suggested I had a choice. Just Emma assuming, as she always assumed, that my time belonged to her. I set down my tea and stared at the screen, reading those words, over and over until they blurred. 20 years of this. 20 years of being the one who showed up early and stayed late, who scrubbed dishes while everyone else laughed in the living room, who wrapped presents for children that weren't mine, while Emma posted photos online about the magic of family. I remembered last Christmas with painful clarity. I had driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to arrive on the 22nd. For 3 days, I cooked meals for 15 people, while Emma floated through the house in cashmere sweaters, accepting compliments on her hospitality. I remembered standing at the sink at 11 o'clock at night, elbow deep in greasy water, listening to the sound of my family opening presents in the next room without me. When I finally joined them, the wrapping paper was already cleared away. No one had saved my gifts to open together. They'd just forgotten I wasn't there. And the photos. God, the photos. I was in exactly none of them, because I was always the one holding the camera. Natalie, you take such good pictures, Mum would say, and I'd smile, and click the shutter, capturing perfect family moments that proved I existed only as a ghost behind the lens. My eyes drifted to the shelf above my small television, where a single framed photograph sat apart from the others. In it, a younger version of me stood beside Grandpa Robert, in front of his cabin by the lake, both of us squinting against the summer sun, both of us smiling like we shared a secret the rest of the world didn't understand. He passed 3 years ago, and the loss still ached like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Before he died, he'd held my hand in that hospital room and said something I'd carried with me ever since. You're the strongest one in this family, Natalie. Don't let them forget that. I never knew exactly what he meant. Grandpa saw things other people missed. Beside the photo sat a birthday card slightly bent at the corners. Aunt Margaret had sent it 2 weeks ago, the only member of my family who remembered my birthday, without a Facebook reminder. Margaret was Mum's younger sister, quiet and watchful at family gatherings, the kind of woman who observed more than she spoke. She'd written simply, "Thinking of you, sweetheart," always. Something about those words had made me keep the card instead of throwing it away. My phone buzzed again, pulling me back to the present. Emma's name flashed across the screen, followed by another message, then another. I watched them stack up like a verdict being delivered. Each notification another stone added to a weight I'd been carrying alone for as long as I could remember. I picked up my phone with a strange sense of dread settling into my chest. But the next message from Emma wasn't just demanding, it was an insult disguised as instruction, and something inside me finally began to crack. Emma's second message read, "And don't bring store-bought gifts again. Try harder this year. The kids deserve better." I read it 3 times, each time feeling the words cut a little deeper. Try harder. As if I hadn't been trying my entire life. As if every sacrifice I'd ever made had been somehow insufficient. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept replaying her words in my head, mixing them with older memories, older wounds that had never quite healed. By morning, I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left nothing but exhaustion behind. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I stared at my computer screen for hours, moving my mouse occasionally, so it would look like I was busy, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was Carol who finally noticed. Carol Henderson was 62 years old, a project coordinator who'd worked at the firm longer than anyone else, and she had a way of seeing through people that I'd always found both comforting and slightly terrifying. She appeared at my desk around noon with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said she wasn't going anywhere until I talked. We ended up in the corner of the office cafeteria at a table by the window where no one could overhear us. I told her about Emma's texts, about the expectation that I would show up early and babysit 4 children while my sister attended holiday parties. I told her about the insult wrapped in instruction, about being told to try harder when I'd been trying harder than anyone for 20 years. Carol listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold in front of her, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, she said something that would stay with me for days afterward. "A family that forgets your worth sometimes needs a reminder," she said slowly. "But, honey, here's the real question. Do you remember your worth?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was, I didn't know anymore. Somewhere along the way, I'd gotten so used to being overlooked that I'd started to believe I deserved it. Carol asked me to tell her more, so I did. I told her about last Thanksgiving when I'd flown home 3 days early to help prepare. I spent 2 full days in that kitchen, cooking a turkey and 3 side dishes, and 2 pies from scratch, while Emma wandered in and out occasionally, moving a serving spoon from one place to another. When dinner was finally served and Mum stood up to make a toast, she raised her glass and said, "I want to thank Emma for organising everything so beautifully. I don't know what we'd do without her." I remember sitting there with gravy still under my fingernails, watching my sister accept praise for work she hadn't done and saying nothing. I never said anything. That was the problem. But then, I told Carol the part that really mattered, the part I'd never told anyone outside my family. 2 years ago, my father had a minor stroke. He recovered, but during those terrifying weeks, when we didn't know if he would, my parents discovered they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. They were going to lose the house. I was the one who transferred $35,000 from my savings account to keep the bank from foreclosing. $35,000 that I'd spent 4 years saving, that I'd planned to use as a down payment on a home of my own someday. I gave it without hesitation because that's what family does. But at Christmas dinner that year, when Dad stood up to thank everyone for their support during his illness, he looked directly at Emma and said, "I want to especially thank my daughter Emma, who sacrificed so much to save this family." Emma had contributed $2,000. $2,000 out of $37,000. And she sat there accepting thanks for my sacrifice, and I said nothing because I never did. Carol's face had gone very still. "How much have you given them over the years?" she asked quietly. I'd done the math the night before, adding up transfers and loans that were never repaid and emergency funds that somehow always flowed in one direction. $47,000, I said. Over 10 years. The number hung between us like something shameful, though I wasn't sure anymore who should be ashamed. Carol leaned forward. "Does Emma's husband know about any of this?" The question caught me off guard. Ryan was an accountant, meticulous about money, in a way that bordered on obsessive. He tracked every expense questioned, every purchase built spreadsheets to analyze their household budget. If he knew that Emma had borrowed thousands of dollars from me over the years and never paid any of it back, there would be problems, serious problems. But I had never told him. I'd never told anyone outside the family. Some misguided sense of loyalty, I suppose, or maybe just the habit of protecting people who never protected me. No, I said finally. Ryan doesn't know. Carol just looked at me with those knowing eyes, and I could see the question she wasn't asking. Why do you keep protecting them when they've never once protected you? I didn't have an answer. I'd been asking myself the same thing for years. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights dimmed and the city quiet outside my window. Emma's texts still glowed on my phone screen unanswered. Mum had sent a follow-up message telling me to stop being difficult and just do what my sister asked. Dad had weighed in with his usual bluntness. If you're going to make this hard, maybe you shouldn't come at all. The message was clear. My presence was only wanted if it came with service attached. Carol's question kept echoing in my head. Do you remember your worth? I thought about $35,000 and a thank you speech that mentioned someone else's name. I thought about $47,000 over 10 years and nothing to show for it but exhaustion and invisibility. I thought about every Christmas spent behind a camera, every Thanksgiving spent behind a stove, every family memory that existed only because I'd made it possible while getting erased from the story. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop, created a new spreadsheet, and started documenting every dollar I'd ever given my family, every sacrifice I'd ever made, every lie that had been told about who really saved whom. I spent 3 days adding to that spreadsheet, filling in dates and amounts from bank statements and old text messages, watching the numbers grow into something undeniable. By day 5, I had documented everything. $47,000, 10 years of invisible sacrifice reduced to rows and columns on a glowing screen. I didn't know what I planned to do with it yet, but having the proof felt like armor I didn't know I needed. That evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. Family video call in 10 minutes. Emma had scheduled it without asking if the time worked for anyone else, which was typical. I considered ignoring it, letting them talk about Christmas without me, but something made me click the link anyway. Maybe I wanted to see if anything had changed. Maybe I just wanted to watch them prove that nothing ever would. The call connected, and suddenly my screen was filled with familiar faces, arranged in their usual positions. Mum and Dad sat together on the living room couch, looking older than I remembered, but still solid, still commanding the centre of the frame. Emma appeared from her pristine kitchen, her blonde hair perfect, her makeup flawless, even for a casual family call. And, in a small square at the bottom corner, barely visible, sat Aunt Margaret. She looked tired, her grey hair pulled back simply, her expression neutral in that careful way she always wore around my mother. I hadn't expected her to be included, and something about her presence made me pay closer attention than I might have otherwise. The conversation started the way it always did, with Emma listing her problems. The kids were exhausting. Ryan was working too much. The holiday parties were stressful. She needed help, she said, looking directly into the camera as if daring anyone to disagree. Mum nodded sympathetically at every complaint, making soft sounds of concern, treating Emma's busy social calendar like a genuine hardship. Then Dad cleared his throat and turned the discussion to Christmas logistics. We need to figure out who's doing what, he said, and I felt myself tense. I already knew where this was going. Emma has 4 kids and a busy husband. Dad continued, his voice carrying that tone of finality he used when he expected no argument. Natalie, you're single. You have time. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement that invited response. It was simply the way things were in my family, spoken aloud like natural law. No one asked if I had plans. No one wondered if my job might have demands during the holiday season. No one considered that being single didn't mean being empty, that my time had value, even if I wasn't spending it on a husband and children. I was simply Available by default, a resource to be allocated rather than a person to be consulted. Emma picked up where Dad left off, outlining my duties with the efficiency of a manager assigning tasks to staff. I would arrive on December 20th, 4 days before Christmas. I would help prepare the house, do the grocery shopping, begin the cooking. I would watch the children while Emma attended her parties and handled the important social obligations. I would essentially live in her guest room and work from the moment I woke until everyone else went to bed. Emma herself would supervise, she explained, making sure everything met her standards. Mum added helpfully, "Your sister has enough on her plate, Natalie. Someone has to step up." It was Aunt Margaret's voice that cut through the familiar script, quiet but sharp. "I remember perfectly, Linda," she said, and something in her tone made everyone pause. Mum's smile flickered just for a moment before she recovered and changed the subject. But I caught Margaret's eyes through the screen, and what I saw there stopped my breath. Understanding, recognition, the look of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be standing where I stood because she had stood there herself once. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Margaret barely spoke for the rest of the call, retreating back into her corner of the screen, but I felt her watching, waiting, seeing things the others refused to see. Near the end of the call, I asked a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I'd looked at that old photograph on my shelf. Whatever happened to Grandpa's cabin? I tried to keep my voice casual, like it was just idle curiosity. The one by the lake? I was thinking about it the other day. The reaction was immediate and strange. Dad's face went tight, his jaw clenching the way it did when he was caught off guard. "That was sold years ago," he said quickly, too quickly. "Nothing worth discussing." Mum shot him a look I couldn't quite read. Something between warning and worry, and then she launched into a story about Christmas decorations that had nothing to do with anything. The subject was closed before it had ever really opened. But I noticed the way they stumbled over each other to move past my question. I noticed that no one would meet my eyes. And I noticed that Aunt Margaret, in her quiet corner of the screen, had leaned forward slightly when I mentioned the cabin, her expression shifting into something that looked almost like concern. After the call ended, I sat in the silence of my apartment trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The cabin had been Grandpa's pride and joy, the place where I'd spent every summer of my childhood learning to fish and identify birds and sit quietly while storms rolled across the water. He'd loved that place more than almost anything. The idea that it had been sold without anyone telling me felt wrong somehow, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit the picture I thought I knew. My phone buzzed with a new message. I expected it to be Emma, sending additional instructions, or Mum smoothing over the awkward moment about the cabin with some pleasant distraction. But when I looked at the screen, the name that appeared was Aunt Margaret. Her message was only 6 words long, but something about them made my heart beat faster. "I see you, sweetheart. Call me." I stared at Aunt Margaret's message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the call button. But before I could decide whether to reach out, my phone began buzzing with other notifications. The family group chat was lighting up again, and I watched the messages arrive one after another, like punches I couldn't dodge. Emma's name appeared first. "Also, I need you to transfer $500 for Christmas decorations. The house needs to look perfect this year, and I've already maxed out my budget. I'll pay you back later." I almost laughed at that last part. Later. Emma still owed me $3,000 from 2 years ago money she'd borrowed for a kitchen renovation and never mentioned again. In Emma's vocabulary, later meant never, and we both knew it. She just didn't care enough to pretend otherwise anymore. Mum's message came next, her words carrying that particular tone of gentle manipulation she'd perfected over decades. "Natalie, just do what your sister asks. You've always been the strong one. Emma needs more support than you do." There it was again. The strong one. The phrase that had been used my entire life to justify why I received less while giving more. Being strong apparently meant I didn't need kindness. didn't deserve consideration, didn't warrant the same love and attention my sister took for granted. My strength wasn't something they admired, it was something they exploited. Then Dad weighed in, and his message carried no softness at all. If you're going to make this difficult, maybe you shouldn't come. We don't need drama during the holidays. I read those words 3 times, waiting for the familiar sting of rejection, the hurt that usually bloomed in my chest whenever my father made clear how little my presence mattered. But this time, something strange happened. I felt nothing. The pain I expected didn't arrive. Instead, there was only a vast, quiet emptiness, like someone had finally cut a wire that had been sparking for years. My phone buzzed once more. Dad again. I won't have you ruining Christmas for everyone. Either help your sister or stay away. Those are your options. I sat in my dark apartment holding those words in my hands, and I realized the numbness was somehow worse than any pain I'd ever felt. Pain meant I still cared, still hoped, still believed things could change. This emptiness meant something inside me had finally given up. My father had just told me in plain terms that my value to this family was purely transactional. Show up and serve, or don't show up at all. There was no third option where I came as a daughter, as a sister, as someone worth loving for reasons beyond what I could provide. I looked back at Aunt Margaret's message. I see you, sweetheart. Call me. 6 words that felt more like family than anything my parents had said in years. I pressed the call button before I could talk myself out of it. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice careful and quiet, like she'd been waiting. I wondered if you'd call, she said. I've been watching this happen for a long time, Natalie. Longer than you know. She paused and I heard her take a breath. Your mother did the same thing to me 30 years ago. When our parents needed help, I was the one working 2 jobs to pay their bills. I was the one who drove 3 hours every weekend to check on them, who handled their medications and their appointments and their fears. But when they passed, your grandmother's eulogy only mentioned Linda. How devoted Linda was. How much Linda sacrificed. Her voice carried old wounds that had never fully healed. I wish I'd spoken up sooner. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe they wouldn't have. But at least I wouldn't have spent so many years wondering. I felt tears building behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. Someone finally saw what I'd been living. Someone understood. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. Margaret sighed. Because by the time I found my voice, it felt too late, and because your grandfather asked me to wait. He saw everything, Natalie. He knew exactly how Linda and your father treated you, how Emma was raised to believe she deserved more than everyone else. Before he passed, he told me he'd made arrangements. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of, that you had something that was just yours. My heart began beating faster. What kind of arrangements? There was a long pause. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was lower, more serious. After Robert died, I helped sort through his things. I found letters in his desk, correspondence with his lawyer about his estate, about leaving you the cabin. The cabin. Grandpa's cabin by the lake, the place where I'd spent every summer, the place that held more happy memories than anywhere else in my life. He wanted you to have it, Margaret continued. The letters made that clear. But when I asked your mother about it, she said you declined the inheritance. She said you signed papers giving up your claim because you didn't want the responsibility of maintaining the property. The world seemed to tilt around me. I never signed anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one ever told me about any inheritance. I thought the cabin was sold. Dad said on the call tonight that it was sold years ago. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's what I was afraid of, she said finally. Natalie, I don't know exactly what happened, but I know your grandfather loved you more than anyone, and I know he wouldn't have left you out of his will. If you never signed anything, if no one ever told you. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, feeling something shift inside me. The numbness was still there, but underneath it something else was waking up. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something clearer. My family hadn't just ignored me. They hadn't just exploited me. They had stolen from me. They had taken something my grandfather meant for me to have and made it disappear, and they had let me believe I was worthless while they did it. I picked up my phone again, looking at the messages from Emma and Mum and Dad, all those demands and ultimatums and casual cruelties, and for the first time in my life, my hands didn't shake when I held the screen. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was done being afraid. The days that followed were the quietest of my life, but beneath that stillness, something was building. I didn't respond to Emma's demand for $500. I didn't answer Mum's messages about being the strong one. I didn't acknowledge Dad's ultimatum about helping or staying away. Instead, I did something I should have done years ago. I started gathering proof. My spreadsheet from before became the foundation, but now I expanded it into something more thorough. I pulled up every bank statement from the past 10 years, highlighting transfers to my parents and sister in yellow, adding notes about what each amount was supposedly for. The medical bills when Dad had his stroke. The emergency car repair Emma needed. The loan for the kids' school supplies that was never repaid. The countless smaller amounts that had bled out of my account over a decade of being the family safety net. I screenshotted text messages where money was requested, then matched them with the follow-up conversations, where credit was given to someone else. When Mum thanked Emma publicly for saving the house, I had the bank record showing my transfer dated 3 days earlier. When Dad praised Emma's generosity during his recovery, I had the receipt proving I'd paid the hospital directly. $47,000 over 10 years, documented with timestamps and amounts, and the lies that followed each sacrifice. On the second day, I called the phone number Aunt Margaret had given me. It belonged to the law firm that had handled Grandpa's estate, a small practice 2 towns over from where my parents lived. The receptionist transferred me to a junior associate who pulled up the file while I waited on hold, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When he came back on the line, his voice was careful, professional, but I could hear something underneath it. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "Ms. Rhodes, I'm glad you called," he said. "There's an unresolved matter regarding your grandfather's estate that we've been trying to address for 3 years. 3 years. Grandpa had been gone for 3 years, and all that time his lawyers had been trying to reach me. We sent multiple letters," the associate continued, "but they were all returned or went unanswered. The contact address on file was your parents' home. We assumed you'd relocated and they would forward our correspondence. They never forwarded anything, not a single letter. I felt sick as the associate kept talking, explaining that someone had provided the firm with a document claiming I had waived my inheritance rights. A signed waiver, supposedly from me declining any claim to the property my grandfather had left in my name. I never signed anything," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "I never received any letters. No one told me there was an inheritance at all." The line went quiet for a moment. "Ms. Rhodes, if that's the case, we need to meet in person. There may be grounds for a formal investigation." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Grandpa and the cabin by the lake. I remembered summers that seemed to last forever, the 2 of us sitting on the dock with fishing poles, while dragonflies skimmed across the water. He taught me to identify birds by their songs, pointing out cardinals and blue jays, and the occasional hawk circling overhead. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching storms roll in from across the lake, the sky turning purple and gold, while thunder rumbled in the distance. He never made me feel like I was too much or not enough. He just let me be myself, and that was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. Emma had hated the cabin. She complained about the lack of internet, the distance from shopping centres, the bugs and the humidity and the boring quiet of nature. She stopped coming after she turned 13, and Grandpa never pushed her. But I kept coming every summer until I left for college, and sometimes even after that. The last time I visited before he got sick, Grandpa had put his hand on my shoulder and looked out at the lake and said, "This place will always be here for you, Natalie." I thought he was being sentimental. Now I understood he was making a promise, one my family had stolen from both of us. Over the following days, I tried to write a message to my family. I must have drafted 5 different versions, each one deleted before I could send it. The first was angry, full of accusations and demands. The second was sad, almost pleading, asking why they had done this to me. The third was cold and formal, like a legal notice. The fourth was too long, trying to explain every hurt I'd ever felt. The fifth was too short, just a few bitter words that wouldn't change anything. None of them felt right, because none of them captured what I actually needed to say. I wasn't looking for an apology. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation. I just wanted the truth to exist outside my own head, to be spoken aloud, where they couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I called Aunt Margaret again, and she listened while I talked through my confusion. You spent your whole life protecting people who never protected you, she said. Your silence didn't keep the peace, Natalie. It just gave them permission to keep hurting you. She was right. Every time I stayed quiet, every time I let a slight pass or a lie stand uncorrected, I taught them that there were no consequences for how they treated me. My silence hadn't been strength. It had been surrender. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The anger had settled into something calmer, something more focused. I knew what I needed to do, and I knew that once I did it, there would be no going back. I picked up my phone, opened the family group chat, and began to type. Not a plea, not an apology, not a request for understanding. A declaration. The words came easier than I expected. I typed them slowly, deliberately, reading each sentence aloud before moving to the next. There was no anger in what I wrote, no accusations or demands, just facts. Plain, undeniable facts that had lived in silence for far too long. I won't be coming to Christmas this year, I began. I've spent the last week reviewing my financial records, and I've discovered that I've contributed $47,000 to this family over the past decade. This includes the $35,000 that saved Mum and Dad's house 2 years ago, money that was publicly credited to Emma at Christmas dinner while I sat in silence. Until there's acknowledgement of reality and a genuine conversation about what I've sacrificed for this family, I'll be stepping back from all financial requests. I wish you a peaceful holiday. I read it one final time, then pressed send before I could change my mind. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The message sat there in the group chat marked as delivered, waiting to detonate. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the early morning light spread across the city, feeling strangely calm. Then, my phone began to buzz. Emma's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. She called again immediately, and I declined that one too. Over the next 20 minutes, she called 7 times, each attempt more frantic than the last based on the decreasing gaps between rings. I didn't answer any of them. There was nothing she could say that would change what I'd written, and I wasn't interested in being talked out of the truth. Mum's response came as a wall of text, multiple messages arriving so quickly they stacked on top of each other. She wrote about family loyalty and the importance of keeping private matters private. She accused me of airing dirty laundry, of trying to humiliate people who had only ever loved me. She asked how I could do this to them, how I could betray the people who raised me, how I could be so cruel during the holiday season. Not once did she address the actual content of my message. Not once did she acknowledge the $47,000 or the lie about who saved their house. She talked around the truth like it was an obstacle to be avoided, rather than the entire point. Dad called once. I almost didn't answer, but Something made me pick up some lingering hope that he might surprise me. His voice was cold and measured the tone he used when he was trying to control his anger. "You're acting like a stranger," he said. "Is this about money? Is that what this family means to you? We raised you better than this, Natalie. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't how we handle problems." I listened without interrupting, waiting for some acknowledgement, some hint that he understood why I was upset. It never came. When he finished, I said simply, "I documented everything, Dad. Bank records don't lie." Then I hung up and blocked all 3 numbers. Going to work that day felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream, while my real life burned somewhere behind me. I sat at my desk and answered emails and attended a meeting about project timelines, and the whole time I kept thinking about the grenade I'd thrown into my family. I didn't regret it. That was the strange part. I thought I would feel guilty or scared or desperate to take it back, but instead I just felt lighter, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. The text from Ryan came in the middle of the afternoon, and it changed everything. "Natalie, can we talk privately? Emma is very upset, but I need to understand something." "What do you mean? $47,000 Emma told me years ago that you owed us money, that the $35,000 was a loan to you that we eventually forgave. She said we were being generous by not asking for repayment. I'm looking at our records, and I can't find any evidence of a loan going out. What's going on?" I read his message 3 times, feeling a new kind of shock settle over me. Emma hadn't just taken credit for my sacrifice. She had actually told her husband the opposite of the truth. She had convinced Ryan that I was the one who owed them money, that they were the generous ones for forgiving a debt that never existed. The depth of her deception was staggering. For years, Ryan had believed I was some kind of financial burden on his family when the reality was exactly reversed. I wondered what else she had told him. I wondered how many lies she had built her marriage on. I typed back carefully, keeping my response factual. "Ryan, I have bank records showing every transfer I've made to your family over the past 10 years. The $35,000 went from my account to your in-laws' mortgage company. I can send you the documentation if you want to see it. I never borrowed money from you or Emma. I never owed anyone anything." His reply came quickly. "Please, send everything you have." Later that afternoon, I called the estate lawyer to check on the status of my grandfather's case. The associate's voice was different this time, more serious. "Ms. Rhodes, we've located the waiver document that was submitted to our firm 3 years ago. I can't discuss specific details over the phone, but I need to tell you that there are significant irregularities with what we've found. The signature, the notarization, several elements don't align with standard procedure." He paused. "If what I'm seeing is accurate, there may be grounds for a formal fraud investigation. I strongly recommend we meet in person as soon as possible after the holidays." I agreed to a meeting in early January and hung up feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. That night, after hours of silence, Emma finally sent another message, but this one was different. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "What did you tell Ryan? He's asking questions about everything. He's going through our bank accounts, our credit cards, everything. Natalie, please, you don't understand what you've done." I didn't respond to Emma's panicked message. There was nothing I could say that would fix whatever was unraveling in her marriage, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to fix it. She had spent years building a tower of lies, and now that tower was starting to crumble. That wasn't my fault. That was consequence finally catching up with choices she had made long before I ever spoke up. The week that followed was one of the strangest of my life. While the rest of the world prepared for Christmas with shopping and decorating and cheerful gatherings, my family launched a full-scale assault on my reputation. Emma called every relative she could reach, spinning a story that painted me as unstable and dangerous. I learned this through the concerned text messages that started arriving from cousins and aunts I barely spoke to during normal years. "Hey, Natalie, Emma mentioned you've been going through a hard time. Are you okay? I heard you've been making some accusations. Is everything all right?" The subtext was clear. Emma had told them I was having some kind of breakdown, that I was making up numbers and trying to extort my own family. She had turned my truth into evidence of my supposed mental collapse. Mum's contribution came in the form of a video call request that I foolishly accepted. She appeared on screen with tears streaming down her face, tissues clutched in her hands, performing grief like she was auditioning for a movie. "We gave you everything," she sobbed. "Everything we had, we gave to you girls. And this is how you repay us, by tearing this family apart during Christmas." She told me Dad's heart couldn't take the stress, that I was going to put him back in the hospital, that if anything happened to him, it would be my fault. The manipulation was so transparent, it almost would have been funny if it wasn't so cruel. She never once addressed the money. She never acknowledged the lies. She just cried and accused and tried to make me feel responsible for pain I hadn't caused. Dad's final message arrived 2 days before Christmas. It was short and cold, written with the finality of a door being slammed shut. "You're not welcome in our home until you apologise for the damage you've done to this family. Don't contact us again until you're ready to admit you were wrong." I read those words and felt something strange. Not hurt, not anger, just a quiet recognition that the father I had spent my life trying to please had never really existed. The man who sent that message was the real one. He always had been. Ryan called me on December 20th, and his voice was shaking so badly I almost didn't recognise it. "I went through everything," he said. "Every account, every statement, every record I could find going back 5 years. Emma told me you owed us money. She said the $35,000 was a loan we gave you that you were supposed to be paying us back. She made it sound like we were being generous by not pressing you for it." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to hold himself together. "But I found the transfers, Natalie. They all go one direction, from you to us. Every single one. There's not a single dollar that ever went from our accounts to yours." He told me he had also discovered $18,000 in credit card debt that Emma had hidden from him, spending that couldn't be explained by their household expenses. "I'm staying at a hotel for a few days," he said quietly. "I need to figure out what's real and what's been a lie. I don't know what to believe about anything anymore." 3 days before Christmas, Aunt Margaret drove 4 hours to meet me at a coffee shop near my apartment. She brought a folder of documents she had been gathering since our first phone call, papers she had found among Grandpa's belongings, and records she had requested from various sources. Her face was serious as she spread the pages across the table between us. "I had a friend look at this, she said, pointing to the waiver document that had supposedly signed away my inheritance. He used to work as a document examiner for the state. He compared the signature on this paper to samples of your actual handwriting." She pulled out several items. I recognised a birthday card I had sent her years ago, a letter I had written to Grandpa when I was in college, a form I had signed at a family event. The signature on the waiver looked similar at first glance, but when placed next to my real handwriting, the differences became obvious. The slant was wrong. The pressure points were inconsistent. Several letters were formed in ways I had never written them. "It's not your signature," Margaret said quietly. "Someone forged your name to steal what your grandfather left you." I sat there staring at the evidence, feeling the weight of what it meant settle over me. My family hadn't just taken credit for my sacrifices. They hadn't just exploited my silence and my loyalty. They had committed actual fraud. They had forged my signature on a legal document to steal property that was rightfully mine. The cabin by the lake, the place where I had spent the happiest summers of my childhood, the inheritance my grandfather had specifically wanted me to have had, been taken from me through criminal deception. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Not all of my relatives had believed Emma's story. Uncle David, my father's younger brother, sent me a private message asking if we could talk. His tone wasn't accusatory or concerned in that patronising way. He just said something felt off about what Emma was telling everyone, and he wanted to hear my side. Cousin Lisa Margaret's daughter reached out with similar questions. She remembered how I had always been treated at family gatherings, how I was always working while Emma was always relaxing, and she wondered if there was more to the story than Emma was admitting. I made a decision then. I wouldn't blast my evidence across social media or send mass emails to the entire family. That kind of public warfare wasn't who I wanted to be. But I would respond honestly to anyone who asked directly. I would tell the truth to those who were willing to listen. Christmas Eve morning, I woke to pale winter light filtering through my curtains and a notification on my phone. The estate lawyer had called while I was sleeping and left a voicemail asking me to return his call immediately. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed back some part of me already knowing what he was going to say. He answered on the first ring and his voice was grave. Ms. Rhodes, we've completed our preliminary analysis with the help of a forensic document specialist. I wanted you to know before the holiday. He paused, and in that pause I heard the confirmation of everything I had suspected. The signature on that waiver is not yours. Your family committed fraud. I thanked the lawyer and hung up the phone, then sat in silence for a long time. Fraud. My own parents had committed fraud to steal my inheritance. The word kept echoing in my head, each repetition making it more real and somehow less surprising. Part of me had known the truth for weeks, maybe longer, but hearing it confirmed by a legal professional transformed suspicion into something solid, something I could hold in my hands and decide what to do with. The lawyer had explained my options during our call. Criminal prosecution was possible. Forging a signature on a legal document was a serious offence, and the evidence was clear enough to pursue charges. But he also warned me that going that route would be messy, expensive, and emotionally devastating. It would mean lawyers and courtrooms and testimony, months or years of my life consumed by fighting my own family in public. The cabin would eventually be mine either way, he assured me. The fraud was documented. The question was whether I wanted to destroy my parents legally or simply reclaim what was stolen. I chose a middle path. I compiled all my evidence into a clear, organised file, the bank records proving $47,000 in transfers, the forged waiver, with the expert analysis showing the signature wasn't mine, and the documentation Ryan had shared showing how Emma had lied to him about our financial relationship. Then, I made a decision about who would see what. The relatives who had reached out asking for my side Uncle David and cousin Lisa and a few others received the bank records. Those were facts, not accusations numbers that spoke for themselves. The forgery evidence I kept private for now, a weapon I hoped I would never need to use but wanted available if my family tried to rewrite history again. The dominoes began falling almost immediately. Uncle David called my father on Christmas Eve morning, and I learnt later from cousin Lisa what happened. David had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. But the bank records I sent him were impossible to explain away. He confronted my father directly, his voice rising loud enough that Lisa could hear it from the next room. You let us believe Emma saved the family. You took credit for money Natalie gave you. And now I'm hearing rumours about forged signatures and stolen property. What the hell is going on, Robert? My father apparently tried to deflect, to minimise, to blame me for causing trouble. But David wasn't buying it anymore. He told my father that he and his wife would not be coming to Christmas dinner, and he suggested my father use the holiday to think about what kind of man he had become. Other relatives followed David's lead. One by one, the extended family who had planned to gather at my parents' house found reasons to stay away. Some cited the weather, others mentioned last-minute conflicts, but the real reason spread through phone calls and text messages, like wildfire. The perfect family image my parents had cultivated for decades was crumbling, and no one wanted to sit at a table pretending everything was fine. Emma's Christmas, I heard through Ryan, was a disaster. She spent the day in a house with 4 children who didn't understand why their cousins weren't coming, parents who could barely look at each other, and a husband who had moved to a hotel and filed for legal separation. Ryan had discovered even more financial deception during his audit, hidden credit cards and unexplained expenses that had nothing to do with me. The life Emma had built on lies was collapsing from every direction, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, even if I had wanted to. She called me on Christmas afternoon, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Mum and Dad said taking the cabin was for the best, that you didn't need it, that you were doing fine on your own, and we needed it more. I just went along with what they said. I didn't think it through." I listened to her crying, waiting for something that sounded like genuine accountability. It never came. Even now, she was blaming our parents, positioning herself as someone who had been swept along by forces beyond her control, rather than an active participant in stealing from her own sister. "I'm sorry, Natalie, I really am. Can we please just move past this?" I took a breath before responding, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I'm not interested in apologies that come with excuses, Emma. You didn't just go along with something. You lied to your husband about me for years. You took credit for money I gave. You let me feel invisible while you built your life on my sacrifices. If you want a relationship with me someday, you know what honesty looks like. Until you're ready for that, don't contact me again." I spent Christmas Eve alone in my apartment, and for the first time in my adult life, it felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. Aunt Margaret called in the evening, her voice warm, with something that sounded like pride. "You did good, sweetheart. Your grandfather would be so proud of you." Carol sent photos of her grandchildren opening presents, along with a message that said simply, "Thinking of you. You're stronger than you know." Cousin Lisa texted late at night. "Next year, Christmas at my place. Your family, Natalie. The real kind." I sat by my window watching snow fall on the city, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, not yet, but something quieter and more valuable. The peace of finally being seen for who I really was. The cabin would take months to reclaim through legal channels, but my lawyer assured me it would happen. The evidence was overwhelming, and my family had no legitimate defense. But, sitting there in the soft glow of Christmas lights, I realized the cabin wasn't even the most important thing I had reclaimed. I had found my voice. I had stopped protecting people who never protected me. I had chosen truth over comfort, and in doing so, I had finally become the person my grandfather always believed I could be. A week after Christmas, my lawyer sent one final email. "Ms. Rhodes, during our investigation into your grandfather's estate, we discovered something else. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank that was listed in his papers but never opened. According to the records, it was meant for your eyes only. Would you like to schedule a time to see what's inside?" I smiled as I read those words. Grandpa had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Now, finally, I was ready to believe too. And that is where Natalie's story pauses. For now, though, something tells me it is far from over. A grandfather who loved her enough to protect her from beyond the grave. A safety deposit box waiting to reveal its secrets. A family forced to confront the consequences of their own cruelty. Whatever comes next, one thing is certain. Natalie will never go back to being invisible again. This story reminds us of something important. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. Sometimes being the strong one means everyone assumes you don't need kindness or consideration. But strength isn't about how much pain you can absorb in silence. True strength is knowing when to stop sacrificing yourself for people who will never appreciate it. True strength is choosing your own peace over their comfort. Natalie spent 35 years being the invisible backbone of her family, giving $47,000 and countless hours of labour while her sister took all the credit. But when she finally decided to speak the truth, everything changed, not because her family became better people, but because she stopped letting their opinion define her worth. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the one who gave everything while someone else got the credit? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, taken for granted by the people who should have valued you most? Share your story in the comments below. You might be surprised how many others have walked the same painful path. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. We share new content every week, stories of strength, justice, and the courage it takes to reclaim your life. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is not determined by how much you give to people who never give back. You deserve to be seen.